Great. Thank you, Alain, and thank you to CCAPS and other partners for having CARE as part of the panel this morning. And thank you all for joining us this morning, including those who are joining us online. As Ilaria mentioned, CARE conducted with CCAPS a review of EFAD's ASAP program. And that was really intended to see how the commitments that have been made in EFAD's approach to gender equality and women's empowerment, how those were really being translated into project implementation in order to really contribute to what we would call gender transformation. We hear about gender sensitivity, gender responsiveness, but ultimately what we really need in order to achieve gender equality is full-on gender transformation. By gender transformation, ideally what we mean is actively seeking to build equitable social norms and structures in which women operate in the relations that they have, not just within their households, but communities, as well as at a national and a global level. And then even beyond looking at equitable social norms and structures, it's also then about addressing individual gender equitable behavior. And by being gender transformative, it's ideally to address what we might call the gender disadvantage. So in conducting the review, again, it was intended to be a very practical review so that we could see how this is really being translated into program implementation and the impacts that EFAD wants to see through the ASAP program. And then it also, from that review, informed a how-to-do note. And most of what I'll talk about will actually be the content of the how-to-do note. But first, to highlight a few of the key findings of the review of the ASAP program. As Eladia mentioned, part of it really was there's a strong emphasis on women's participation, which is incredibly important, but it also needs to go a step further to ensure that there's also a focus on women's access to the opportunities in the project. And that access can be limited by social norms. It can be constrained by women's labor burden. There was a recognition in the review that a lot of the projects were very aware of the different practical needs that men and women have, but then projects were often designed to be accessible to women in terms of their existing roles, their existing mobility, or their domestic and home-based livelihoods. So it was then potentially reinforcing some of the roles that women are playing. There was, in turn, then a limited focus across the projects in focus on gender dynamics and how those dynamics really shape men's and women's different vulnerabilities to climate change, as well as their different capacities to adapt. And then finally, not all of the projects, but a number of them did also have gender focal points. And those focal points were really able to serve to ensure that the gender action plan was mainstreamed in implementation. So there was a lot of value in that, but not all of the programs or projects had a gender focal point. So after that review, we took a step back and then worked again with CCAPS and EFAD to develop a how-to-do note. And that built on the review findings and was intended to provide very practical advice for any practitioner on how to develop a gender transformative program. And again, there's a little bit of an overview on the slide of gender transformative. I'll summarize a few of the key points from the how-to-do note. You have an advanced draft on some of the chairs in front of you as well. But we do expect that it'll be published and then available on FAO and EFAD's websites in the next few months. So one of the first areas that we looked at was understanding gender and social norms. And really understanding those norms is important for understanding how they govern an individual's adaptive capacity. And that's then a first step in designing a gender transformative program. And that means really looking at three things. First, risk, vulnerability, and capacity. Understanding how men and women and girls and boys experience climate change differently because of the roles that they play, because of the access to resources that they do or do not have. That then enables, in project design, it enables identification of the best ways to build adaptive capacity for different populations in a household and community so that those interventions really target their individualized needs. It's also about looking at household decision making and being able to support women's roles as equal decision makers in households. that enables them to be empowered to fully benefit from other interventions in a program, for instance, the adoption of different agricultural practices, because that then means that women are also, with their male partners, able to decide which practices, how they adopt them, and then also to voice their needs that enable them to then adopt those practices. And the third is taking a really hard look and addressing the labor burden that women carry. Women have a dual labor burden of both unpaid farm work, often being responsible for their household's food security, so cultivating the crops and the food that their family eats, but then they also have a very heavy domestic care burden. And being mindful of that labor burden is critical because of the focus on also ensuring women's meaningful participation. There's a need to ensure that adding that participation is not just adding to their labor burden. And a couple examples of how CARE has looked at one or more of these issues within gender and social norms is our gendered climate vulnerability and capacity analysis, a very participatory tool for working with communities to identify what vulnerabilities they see, what impacts they see, and the things that they believe need to be addressed to enhance their capacity. And by doing that in a gendered sense, not only are you getting direct information from communities of how they perceive their own vulnerabilities in their own context, but you're also ensuring that you are tapping what women see as their vulnerability versus what men see, because given different gender roles, they might be quite different. Another example of a tool that we have used in programs to look at women's labor burden is to work with men and women in a household to do a clock exercise, to sit down and say, well, where does each hour of my day go? And women are able very much to tell you where every single hour of their day goes. And it raises awareness within the household and the community, not just of how many hours women are working, but of the intense labor burden that they do carry. And it then provides an opening for a conversation within households and communities about a different sharing of that labor burden. Another issue we looked at in the review was how to tackle women's very unequal access to and control over resources, because transforming that is very critical to begin to address some of the systemic discrimination that we see that shapes women's access to climate information, to land, to education, extension services, technology, inputs, and financial services. And as Eladia also mentioned, that unequal access really shapes how women can adapt. And if we were to address it, it would very much shape how we're able to address global hunger. We know from FAO, not just on the 12 to 17% reduction in hunger, but that's up to 150 million people who would not be chronically hungry if we simply addressed the unequal access to resources between men and women. Again, to give a concrete example, in CARE's Pathways program, over the course of the project, we've been able to mobilize women's access to 11,000 acres of land, which is half the size of Manhattan. And that's been done through very rigorous gender dialogue at a community level between men and women, but also with community elders and chiefs who are looking at allocation of land. So it's a very deliberate conversation about current dynamics and about what those dynamics mean for communities. The next was then picking up on a focus of EFAD's ASAP projects is the planning and decision-making process. Given unequal power relations and marginalization in communities, vulnerable groups, youth, and women are often excluded from what can be very top-down decision-making. And when those decision-making processes aren't inclusive, it means that their perspective and their needs may not be met, because they're not actually being voiced. Whereas if you do include all of those different groups in a very inclusive decision-making process, it better informs service delivery, because you can make sure that your interventions are meeting different populations' needs. It means that it's more responsive then to their needs, but it also includes their knowledge, because the communities that we work with know best the context in which they live. So for them to be able to say, this is the context that we're seeing, these are the barriers that we're facing, these are the incentives that would work for us, it ultimately means that you're reaching the needs of a broader set of people. That then does have to work in tandem, as I mentioned before, with gender dialogues that promote women's participation, but also address that unequal labor burden so that women are not just having an addition to their labor burden. There's also then a role for policy to play in this process, because it isn't just decision-making and planning at a household or community level. It really is also about decision-making at a national and a global level, ensuring that local, national, community-level policies or policies here within the UNFCCC reflect the needs of small-scale food producers, women, and youth. And a lot of that is about ensuring their participation in the process itself. Finally, in any program, you come full circle and you make sure that you have a robust monitoring, evaluation, and learning program. This also is something that can be gender transformative. That means that you're engaging communities, women and youth, in the process of reflecting on the project itself. You may work with the community in a participatory fashion to develop indicators of what kind of change the community is looking for. That's particularly important as we think about adaptation, because different individuals' needs and adaptation are different, and adaptation needs change over time. And adaptation, we've often talked about, is as much a process as it is an outcome, because you are grappling with consistent change and figuring out how you access the resources, from decision-making to financial services to inputs to practices that actually enable you to adapt in that process. Having participatory and gender-responsive monitoring, evaluation, and learning also empowers local stakeholders to continue to voice their needs, so that they're able to say, this worked for me, this didn't, how can we change this, let's think about some new ideas. And by that, you have a continual learning process as you go either to the next stage of a program or as you design the next project itself. And one example that we've done for this within some care work in terms of a tool is a participatory performance tracker. This is something that can be used throughout the life cycle of a program. And it's sitting down with the community to look at all the different practices or behaviors at an individual, household, community level, and seeing which households have been able to adopt those practices and which haven't. And when you see that a household is perhaps lagging behind on a number of the interventions that are being talked about, there's then an entry point to figure out what's happening in that household that's creating an obvious additional barrier, so that you can make sure they are also able to adopt a lot of those practices with their colleagues. Ultimately, my time is over. Ultimately, it does come back to investing in program capacity, ensuring that gender analysis is your first step, making sure that you understand what the barriers are, what the context is. And then it's also figuring out what is your action plan based on that analysis, so that you're working with communities and with households to make sure you're targeting interventions at the different barriers and the different dynamics in the context. And then having that gender focal point ensures that you have someone who is making sure that this moves forward. We've also seen here in the UNFCCC, in the Lima Work Program on Gender, there is a focal point. And that really is designed to help move everything forward. So it's also about that broad-based program capacity. And I'm happy to take any questions.